Hello and welcome back. Now we have just finished creating an aim offset that allows us to look and move the direction of the gun and the upper body, and this will allow us to shoot our gun in the correct direction, and it looks like our gun is pointing in the right direction. Now we have the ability to aim, and she does lift the gun up to her head when she's aiming, but we actually can create an aim offset designed for aiming. And if we go into our character's animations folder, we can right click and create a new aim offset for aiming. So let's do that. Let's right click, go to animation, and choose aim offset and use Bellicus skeleton. And this will be aiming aim offset. And this will be the aim offset for when she's aiming. Now we're going to make our horizontal axis yaw again. So make that yaw, and vertical axis is going to be pitch. So same as the other aim offset. Now for the minimum axis value for the horizontal axis, for the yaw, in this case we're going to go with -90 to +90 for minimum and maximum axis values. And that's because when we're aiming, we don't need to look all the way around behind us 180 degrees. We only want it to be from -90 to +90. And vertical axis will also be -90 to +90 as well. Now, in the asset browser, search for RMB_AO, and you'll get a bunch of assets for right mouse button aim offset. That's what that stands for. Right mouse button is what was designated for aiming when these were created. Now you'll look all the way down at the bottom and see RMBAOCC. CC stands for center center. That's what will go in the very middle. Now for number of grid divisions, we're going to want something in the very middle here. So make sure number of grid divisions says 4, so that way we have this cross right here in the middle. Now we can add an asset to the middle, and we're going to add RMBAOCC to the middle. Notice she disappears, and that's because in the additive settings, preview base pose was automatically set to the animation that we first put in. And RMBAOCC is an additive animation. We need to set this back to that 0 pose. So search for 0 and select idle 0 pose. That will be the base pose here. So let's take a look at what we're going to have for our animations in here. Now I'm going to take a look at RMBAO R45. This is 45 degrees to the right, and drag that in and stick it right there to the right. You'll see that the preview base pose changes again, and notice that she's looking to the right, and it looks like I put R45D, that's supposed to be R45 looking down, so that's going to go down there. We wanted RMBAO R45 for this part here, so it's looking right. We already got the R45D, that's for looking down. We might as well use R45 up to look up. That's going to be right here at 45 in the yaw and 90 in the pitch. And now she can look up and down at 45 degrees. Now RMBAORC is going to be the right center, so we'll stick that there. And we can also do RMBAORU for right up, setting that to 0 pose, and she's looking right and up. You can also do RD for right down, again setting it to 0 pose, and she's looking right and down. Now notice it doesn't look like she's aiming anymore. And that's because we actually used the 0 pose, which is her holding the gun at her hip basically and not aiming. And you might have noticed that if you type in 0, you'll see RMB 0 pose. That's actually the one we want. So go ahead and select that, and now you'll see that she's got her gun up to her face and she's aiming it. We can just wait till we've dragged all of our animations in and then finally change this at the end. So I'll go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to find RMBAOCU for center up. That's going to go up in the center. Center down will go down in the middle. And then we can start doing the left. We have AOL45D. That's going to go 45 degrees and to the left. L45U is left and up. RMBAOL45 is in the middle, 45 to the left. And then we have AOLU, that's all the way to the left and up, AOLD, that's all the way to the left and down, and LC, that's all the way to the left and center. And now finally we can set our base pose to RMB0 pose, and now we can see that she's aiming in all of these and she can look around. Okay, so that is going to take care of our aim offset. So save that and close it. Now let's go into our animation blueprint. So back in character, shooter anim BP, and let's go into our aim offsets here. In aim offsets, you'll see that we blend poses by bool, and we use this aim offset for the hip if we're not reloading. Well, we'd also like to see if we're aiming, and if we're aiming, we'd like to use the aim offset for aiming. It's called aim offset that we just created. Now we could keep blending poses by bool, or we can blend poses by an enum, and that's a lot better if we have different states. So why don't we go ahead and create an enum in the anim instance class, and then we can start blending by enum instead of by bool. So we'll go ahead and save all here, and we'll go back into the anim instance class. Now here in shooter anim instance, let's go ahead and create an enum so that we can use that as a state. And this will be an enum class, so a scoped enum, and we can simply call this offset state. So e offset state, it's going to be a uint8 type enum. And I'm going to give this a uenum macro and make this blueprint type, so we can use this as a type in blueprints, which we will be doing. Now let's make some enum states here. I'm going to prefix this with EOS for E offset state, and I'll call the first one aiming. And I'll give this a UMeta macro, so we can give this a display name. And I'll give this display name aiming. Now at the very bottom, I'm going to add one last state and call this EOS max. And this will be called default max. So we've got that max, and now we can add some more states. So we're going to be aiming in one state, and we can have not aiming in another state. So this will be when we want to use the aim offset for not aiming. So basically hip. In fact, instead of not aiming, that just sounds like we're doing anything other than aiming, but we want this to be using the aim offset for the hip. So why don't we just call this hip instead of not aiming? So this will be EOS hip. So we'll create another one, and for this one, we'll make this the reloading state. So reloading. And this will be for when we're reloading, we don't want to use an aim offset at all. And then finally, one last state we're going to add is going to be called in air, because we want to use an aim offset in the air, but we only want to use the pitch. We don't want to use the yaw. So we'll call this one in air. And it looks like I used an L here instead of a colon. I've been hitting L instead of colon a lot lately, so I'll fix that typo. And now we have an E offset state enum, which has 4 states: aiming, hip, reloading, and in air. Now we can create a variable of this type. Now I'll stick this down in our private variables section, down here at the bottom. It's an E offset state, and we'll call this offset state. And I'll make this visible anywhere, blueprint read only, and we'll stick it in the turn in place. That's fine for the category. And we'll say offset state used to determine which aim offset to use. Now we'll give this a default value in the constructor right here. And for the default value, we're going to say hip because we won't be aiming. So we're going to say E offset state EOS underscore hip, like so. Now we need this offset state to be updated. So down here in update animation properties, we have our B reloading Boolean. Now we're setting this based on the shooter character's combat state, so that's good. Now we also have our B is in air Boolean. We're getting that based off of our character's movement component is falling function. So that leaves our aiming and not aiming states. Let's go look at our shooter character.h, and you'll notice in shooter character.h we have this B aiming Boolean. Let's take a look at that in shooter character.cpp. We'll search for B aiming. We'll see we're checking it in lookup. And when aiming button is pressed, we're setting B aiming to true, and when it's released, we're setting B aiming to false. So that's perfect. We can use this in our shooter anim instance for our state. So let's go down to the very bottom of the if shooter character check in update animation properties, all the way down just before the closing curly brace where we're checking if shooter character. Now the first thing we're going to check is to see if we're reloading. And the reason we're checking this first is because the character could be in the air and reloading at the same time. So in that case, we don't want to use an aim offset if we're in the air and reloading. So in this case, we'll set our offset state to reloading. So offset state equals E offset state reloading. Now, if we're not reloading, then we can check to see if we're in the air. So else if B is in air. And in that case, we'll set our state to in the air. So offset state equals E offset state in air. So next we can check to see if we're aiming. So else if, and we can check our shooter character and see if it's aiming. Now, remember, I think this B aiming is, yes, it's a private variable, so we're going to need a getter for this. So let's go down to the private section. Oh, looks like we did create a getter. It's called get aiming, and it returns B aiming. So we had the foresight for that. So in the else if, we'll see if else if shooter character get aiming. And if that's the case, we'll set offset state to E offset state aiming. And if we're not doing any of those things, then we can set it to hip. So offset state equals E offset state, and we'll choose hip. So the reason we're not using a switch is because we want to check to see first if we're reloading, because we don't want to be using an aim offset if we're reloading, even if we're in the air. Then we want to see if we're in the air, and if we are and we're not reloading, then we'll use a particular aim offset where we're not using the yaw, only the pitch. And then if we're not in the air or reloading, then we'll check to see if we are aiming. Then we'll use an aim offset for aiming, and if none of those are true, we'll use the aim offset for hip. So we'll go ahead and compile this. Okay, so back in the editor, in the aim offsets state machine, in our aim offsets state, instead of blend poses by bool, now we can right click and type blend poses by offset, and we have this E offset state. And we can simply use our offset state here. So if we right click and type get offset state, now we can get our offset state as an enum here in the blueprint, and we can plug that in. And so now we have the opportunity to blend based on the state here. Now the default pose is just something that will go in there. So if the offset state is not one of the selections that we choose, then we'll have a default pose, and that can simply be cached hip to aim. So let's go ahead and drag this up here, and we'll use a cached hip to aim as the default pose here. But then we need to actually have poses for the other states. Now, we don't see any pins for the other states, and that's because we need to right-click and add a pin for each one. So we're going to add a pin for aiming, we're going to right-click, add a pin for hip, right-click, add a pin for reloading, and right-click, add a pin for in air, and we'll have all of those states. Now, we can go ahead and get rid of this blend poses by bool, and instead we'll have blend poses by E offset state. Now for the default pose, we're using cached hip to aim, and for the reloading pose, we're going to have the same thing because we don't really need an aim offset if we're reloading. So we're going to do that cached hip to aim for the reloading pose. Now in the aiming and the hip pose, we're going to use our hip aim offset and our aiming aim offset respectively. So here we've got our hip aim offset, and we'll drag this out here. This will be plugged into the hip pose. So here we have hip aim offset, drag that into hip pose. Now we're also going to use our aiming aim offset, so let's drag that in as well. So here it is, aiming aim offset, and we're going to copy all these pins that went into hip aim offset. We're going to paste them up here because they're going to go into this aiming aim offset. Root yaw offset goes times -1, of course, goes into the yaw, and pitch goes into the pitch, and aiming aim offset can be plugged into aiming pose. And finally, the last thing we have is the in air pose. Now in air, we like to use the hip aim offset. So I'm going to copy all these and paste them down here. And I'm going to plug that into in air. The only difference here though is I don't want to plug anything in for the yaw. I'm going to delete those and use 0 for the yaw. And that way, for the yaw, we'll only be pointing forward when we're in the air, but we'll still be able to rotate up and down using the pitch. So this blend poses is going to blend between all of these based on our enum state, which we're setting in update animation properties. So plug that in, go ahead and compile, and you'll see that we get an error here that says the blueprint self is not a hot reloaded shooter anim instance 0. This can happen sometimes when connections are broken, and all we need to do is save everything and close the editor. So let's close. And we'll compile from our code using Control F5, and that will simply launch the editor again. Okay, so we've launched the editor, and we can go back into our game character folder and open Shooter Anim BP. And here we have our anim graph. If we compile, you'll see it compiles just fine. So sometimes connections can be broken when we're developing, and a simple restart of the engine will help with that. Let's go ahead and give this a test run. So hit play, and let's test our different states. So first we're going to try regular hip state. That's what we should be in, and everything looks good. We're going to try aiming, and it looks like she is in the aiming aim offset, so that looks good. When I jump, I can look up, I can look down, but the yaw is not affected. Now I would like to rotate her body when we're in the air, so we'll fix that as well. And then finally, we'll check the reload state. I'll shoot around and reload, and of course, she doesn't use an aim offset. I'll shoot around and jump and reload and also try, and we can't look up or down. So a couple things. When I jump, I want to be able to rotate the body along with the camera, and that means we don't want to rotate the root bone when we're in the air. That we can fix right away by going into the anim graph, and down here for the rotate root bone, we can blend poses by bool here and blend based on whether or not we're in the air. So let's do that here real quick. We're going to right click and say blend poses by bool, and we're going to right click and get in air. Get is in air, and this will be the bool for this. Now if we are in the air, then we're going to use cache posed cached aim offsets. We're going to use that for true. So I'm going to disconnect that pin, move these down here, and use cache posed cache aim offsets for when we are in the air. And if we're not in the air, well then we can rotate the root bone, so we'll use that for the false state. So I'm going to compile, save that, and play. And now if I jump in the air, now we can actually rotate. So that looks good. And also I'm noticing when I land, it's saving that root offset, that root yaw offset, and it's going to adjust it. And we don't want that. We want that reset. So back in shooteranimInstance.cpp, we're going to go up to the part in our turn in place function where we check to see if speed is equal to 0 and we reset everything. We're also going to reset everything if we're in the air. So we need to say if speed is equal to 0 or b is in air. If either of those are true, then we'll reset all of this stuff, and it'll be basically like when we're running. Our root yaw offset will be reset, and when we land, we won't do any adjusting. So let's test this out. We'll go back and hit play. We'll jump and turn, and we'll land as normal. So that's exactly what we want. Okay, perfect. This will conclude this video. So in summary, we added an aiming aim offset, and we added the ability to blend our poses based on an enum that has multiple states. This will come in very handy being able to do this, as we have different states that require us to have different poses. So save all of your work, and we'll see you in the next video.